It's weird talking in front of a camera. I do this all day, every day. So I'll try not to launch into a sales training video. So, talk for today. On the streaming services, you get previously at St Margaret's. Okay, so previously at St Margaret's applies this time because we've been going, as many of you know, through Nehemiah. And we reach today episode 5, chapter 5, which, thanks James for reading it so well. Chapter 5 builds on the other chapters, so I just need to bring you, if I can, up to speed with what we've covered so far. And Neil, who's been doing all of this, will correct me if I'm wrong. But this is my version of the previous episodes. So it starts with Nehemiah, who's a cupbearer in the court of the king of Persia. So he's got a kind of responsible job, and his brother comes back to him with news from Jerusalem, and he asks about his brethren and fellow Jews, and he gets really bad news. And the bad news is that Jerusalem is in a complete state of collapse. They built the temple, but all the walls had collapsed, and all the houses and everything else like that. And this puts Nehemiah into a funk. Gets really upset about this. And he does what he does typically when he's stressed, which he turns to God. And we see this all the way throughout this book. He doesn't actually jump straight into action. He spends days and weeks fasting and praying. And then eventually, when he's serving the king says, "You look physically all right, but you've obviously got something on your mind." And he steels himself courageously because he's got this top job. The king is omnipotent. And what he's about to say could really put him at risk. And the king says, "Tell me what's troubling you." And so he prays to God. He comes out with what's on his mind. And he says he wants to go to Jerusalem to try and help. Okay? So potentially the king could have turned around and just fired him on the spot, but the king doesn't. As Jeremiah says, God was moving with him. And the king says, "I understand that. How long do you need?" And gives him permission to go. And Nehemiah goes, "Actually, I need some help from you as well. I need some safe passage. I need entitlement to go through the geographies we've got to get. And also, I need some support to do the building of it. So could you give me access to your master kind of wood maker so that I can get some resources?" So he really does go for it. And the king says yes to all because God moved in his favour. So he goes to Jerusalem. He sees the state that it's in, and he eventually talks to the elders. And he says, "Look, we've got to rebuild this." And the elders agree to do it. And so in about chapter 3, they start doing it. And when you see what they do, it's an incredible outpouring of support. It's one of those situations where everybody throws themselves in. The elders, everyone's got a house, they all build their bit of the wall, and it starts going up really quickly. But in chapter 4, what we see is the resistance from the neighbours, the people surrounding, who are not happy that this city is being built up, and they're worried that the Jews are going to start being quite aggressive in the area, and so they start plotting to attack the builders.
And we will come to that next week.
Oh, really? It's next week, is it? Okay, fine. Anyway, so pull it all in, and what happens then is exactly what is happening now. And by now, I mean Putin's attempt to destroy the state of Ukraine. If that was his intention, the exact opposite is happening, because what we see in the case of the Jews responding to external threat is they consolidate. They get even more focused on what's going on. And that's exactly what's happening in Ukraine. People who thought NATO was written off, you remember Donald Trump saying it's not even worth paying the money, and the French being all wobbly about that. Well, suddenly NATO is a force. Who made them a force? Putin did. Humans respond to outside threat. And that's exactly what happened with Nehemiah and the Jews rebuilding Jerusalem. So they really set to it. They have to work with one hand on a trowel, another hand on a weapon. But in this chapter, things start going wrong. And what we just heard is actually the classic case of Satan at work. Satan is incredibly subtle. Putin is not Satan. That's way too overt. Satan works with us in our insecurities and doubts and fears. Just as water in a crack of cement might expand with the cold, so that gradual pressure from within can destroy the strongest edifice. They say a house divided against itself shall surely fall. And what we hear in this chapter is we hear about the oppression that some of the Jews are feeling at the hands of other Jews. This is not about external oppressors. This is about the pressure within. And what's happened I've read it several times. It took me a while, as Neil knows, to get my head around this. But what we've got is basically three types of people struggling. The first lot, they're short of food. Why are they short of food? Well, there's a famine on. They're short of food because the men who would normally be doing all the ploughing and the tilling and the reaping and everything else like that are actually building walls at the moment. So there's a double pressure there. And by the way, look at today. Guess what commodity is top of the charts in terms of inflation? Wheat. When you look at the amount of wheat that comes from Russia that supports us, I think when I looked at it, it was up 40%. So it's matching the fuel prices and everything else like that. Food is in a great shortage. So they come and complain. But that's only one lot. The other lot actually were short of money as well, so we've had to mortgage our properties and things to borrow money, and we're being charged interest. Now, if you go to Leviticus chapter 25, I think I've got it here somewhere. This is straight out of now to us. Charging interest is probably pretty normal, but this is what Leviticus says. If any of your kin fall into difficulty and become dependent on you, you shall support them. Do not take interest in advance or otherwise make a profit from them, but fear your God, let them live with you. Do not take interest. And yet the elders and the landowners were taking interest from people who were struggling. And then there's a third category, the ones who alarmingly were selling their children, their family, into slavery in order to support what they needed to do. And this makes Nehemiah cross. And in Nehemiah, for what it's worth, I see a kind of precursor to Jesus in the way that he responds. And I asked Neil to do the second reading, which is of the woman accused of adultery and how Jesus responds in that situation, which I'll come to. But what does he do? He's angry, righteous anger, but he pauses. He actually, what's his response? I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these complaints. And it says, after thinking it over. How many of us actually think it over? But Nehemiah does. And he spends time with his God. And he goes to the elders, to the rich landowners, the people running the whole ship. And he who has no control over them, he has no authority over them, no formal structure, bravely, once again, another brave step forward, actually confronts them. And he says, this is wrong. It's a sin. What you're doing is a sin against your very people. And he says simply, stop it. And do you know, miracle of all miracles, guess what happens? They agree. I mean, that's the bit that really surprises me about this passage. You know, how often in modern society would somebody who is banged to rights caught out go, fair cop, okay, I'll give him back the money. Yeah, we know it's wrong. Not a chance, eh? But Nehemiah does it. Through the power of God, he gets them to rescind on all the previous problems that they've generated for this generation. He gets them to sort themselves out. And he himself, later on, when we get on to the next part of the passage, demonstrates through his own actions his own way of doing things. So he is authentic in what he's saying, is able to demonstrate that. So what does Nehemiah teach us in all of this? What he teaches us is the most dangerous thing for any project, whether it's building walls or defending our country, is that we are divided against ourselves. And for what it's worth, I take from this passage and I pray that as we go through what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, with the unity that we are appearing to show in terms of NATO and the European allies, where people are behaving in ways you would never have thought. They were in very positive ways as well in many respects as a result of the consequences of Putin's threats and actions. I hope that that unity remains, because that's the biggest threat. The biggest threat is not Putin. Putin will drive a wedge in whatever disunity he's able to create, but I pray that we're able to demonstrate that unity. I pray that we have a Nehemiah, frankly, someone who has a belief and faith in God, knows what is right, calls a sin, and is prepared to call it out even against the strongest people and oppressors. But there's another thing I'd like to draw before I close the talk, which is Nehemiah. For anyone who deals with conflicts of any kind, and I'm not just talking about World War, I'm talking about the kind of conflict that might happen within families or within offices or whatever. What both Jesus and Nehemiah, as his precursor, demonstrate to us is a way that you deal with those kind of situations. In the case of Nehemiah, it would have been very easy for him to appease, to try and get stuck in, to try and negotiate, which is what we typically do, isn't it? We try and work it out, try and find the medium ground. And guess what? There's a psychological model, which some of you may have come across before, called Cartman's drama triangle. This is well plotted if you don't know it. If you want to be introduced, I'm happy to talk to you about it in more detail later. But there are three roles in Cartman's drama triangle. There is the persecutor, and of course the persecutor needs a victim, because that's how it works. And then, as the persecution and victim stuff is going on, along comes the rescuer. And we typically cast ourselves in the rescuer role because we think that's the done thing. And too often what happens is the rescuer ends up being the victim, because they try and get something sorted out between the two people who are having this ding-dong, and the others will turn on him or her, and they accuse him of interfering and not coming up with the right solution, blah, 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 and so the rescuer becomes the victim. I promise you, and I'll allude to these two Bible passages to demonstrate it, I hope. I promise you, if you see the drama triangle beginning to form, and it forms with the victim and the persecutor beginning to have a go, do not become the rescuer. Don't get in there and try and negotiate. Don't try and, quote-unquote, sort it out. You need to keep a professional distance. You need to remain aloof. You need to stick to absolute principles. You need to show empathy, but you need to be direct. The moment you move from that, then the drama triangle is complete. And drama triangles only ever end up in pain. Now, what does Nehemiah teach us? What does Jesus teach us in this? Nehemiah could quite easily have tried to compromise, try and come to some kind of solution. It would have neither met the needs of those that were suffering, nor indeed altered radically the behaviours of the people who were imposing the taxes and the interest and all of that. Instead, he stuck to his principles, he was firm, he communicated it, and as a result of that was able to completely change the situation. And he took his time. He paused. He didn't go wading in. He actually thought about it and chose the right action. Jesus, faced with a typical challenge from the Pharisees, I think it was, wasn't it? I can't remember. Trying to catch him out, the usual thing. Very tempting to kind of get stuck into something like that, isn't it? Unless you are, of course, the Son of God. And what the Son of God does is he just asks a question. Effectively says, well, it's kind of a challenge more than a question. He says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And actually, when we look on the story of the Jews having this internal wrangle and about the real danger to the whole project that was if it hadn't been sorted out quickly, actually sometimes are we a bit like that? Do we look on this and say, well, it's not really what we do? You know, first of all, we don't really worry about charging interest, but you know, how often when we're working together on a project, it all starts off okay, this is what we're going to do, and then a little bit of criticism, needling starts creeping in, you know. We start commenting on the fact that, you know, that Rupert, you know, he stands up and does the talk, but he doesn't actually do an awful lot. Or, and I won't name any other names, because it's not true anyway, but, you know, wouldn't it be great if X did that or Y did that? And we have a little go at, a little bit of a moan, a little bit. We think it's all pretty harmless. We're just getting something off our chest. But it isn't. That's exactly the kind of little crack that devil expands. And that's exactly why great projects and great thrusts fail. Jesus asked the question, and the elders creep away first. I like that. Even in their shame, they're leading the way. And he is left with the woman. And here's the image. Remember, when he's posed the question, he's crouching down and he's writing in the sand, and he doesn't answer. Once again, just like Nehemiah, he takes his time. There's no reason to jump in. And eventually he says to the Pharisees, this is, he is without blame. But they go away and he's still crouching down. I love this image of him still on the sand. And the woman standing there, and she says, where have all the elders gone? Your accusers seem to have disappeared. And she says, yes. And he says, he doesn't let her off the hook. He says, does anyone still accuse you? Where have they gone? He says, no, they don't. And he says, nor do I condemn you, but go away and don't sin again. What an amazing way to cope with a situation like that. How easy it might have been for her to just wander away, having been saved from this predicament. No, don't sin again. And that's exactly how Nehemiah deals with these. He says, do not sin, fear the God. This dispassionate, this ability to be able to help and encourage others, but not to get sucked into the melee and create more of a mess. And I pray as we look at the awful actions that are taking place in Ukraine, that we ourselves are able to keep that steadfastness and to keep that focus on right and wrong. Name Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen.